June 28, 1967, Easton, Bristol, England. It's a Wednesday morning, and something is wrong on Britannia Road. Louisa Dunne always collected her newspaper first thing in the morning. Always. Her neighbors could set their watches by it. The 75-year-old widow would be at her front door by 8 o'clock, watching the world go by, chatting with people as they passed, living her quiet life in the close-knit community she called home for years. But this morning, the newspaper is still sitting on her garden wall, untouched. Her neighbors notice. In a community like Easton, you notice when routines break, when someone who's always visible suddenly isn't there. One neighbor approaches the house, peers through the window past the curtains, and sees Louisa lying on her living room floor. They call the police. When officers arrive at 58 Britannia Road, they find a crime scene that will haunt investigators for nearly 6 decades. Louisa Dunne, a woman who wouldn't hurt a fly according to everyone who knew her, has been strangled to death in her own home. Her sash window is open. There's a palm print on the glass, a left hand pressed against the window frame where someone forced their way inside. She's been raped, she's been robbed, and she's been murdered. The investigation begins immediately. Detectives compare the palm print to 19,000 men. 19,000. And they find nothing. No matches, no suspects, no answers. The case goes cold, and a killer walks free for 58 years. This is the story of Britain's oldest cold case to be solved, and it's about more than just one woman's murder. It's about the pattern that was there all along, the warning signs that were ignored, the system that failed not once, but repeatedly, giving a predator decades of freedom he should never have had. Because Ryland Headley didn't just kill Louisa Dunne and disappear into the shadows. He killed her, and then he did it again and again. And he almost got away with it forever. Welcome to Deadly Intent. I'm Carman Carrion. Before we dive into today's case, I want to tell you about some of the other shows I create. If you love diving deep into the folklore and legends that have terrified communities for centuries, check out Freaky Folklore, where I explore everything from vampires to werewolves. And if you're a fan of spine-tingling tales of the paranormal, Destination Terror takes you to the most haunted locations around the world, uncovering the dark histories behind them. For those of you who enjoy the dark side of storytelling, I also produce Carman's Crypt, original horror fiction and listener-submitted stories that will keep you up at night. You can find all of these shows wherever you're listening right now. Now, let's get into today's episode. Intent. That's what separates accident from murder, passion from premeditation, justice from revenge. It is not the act itself, but the intent behind it that makes it a crime. Today's case is about a woman who should have been safe in her own home. A mother, a grandmother, a widow who'd already buried 2 husbands, a woman who was known in her community, who spent her days watching the world go by from her doorstep, chatting with neighbors. And on a June morning in 1967, when that woman didn't come to collect her newspaper from her garden wall, her neighbors knew something terrible had happened. This is the story of Louisa Dunne and the man who got away with her murder for 58 years. Intent doesn't lie. People do. Let's talk about who Louisa Dunne was, because she deserves to be more than just a victim in a cold case. She deserves to be remembered as a person, a woman with a full life, a history, and a place in her community. Louisa Jane Jarrett was born in 1892, when Queen Victoria was still on the throne. She grew up in Bristol during a time of massive social change, the turn of the century, the suffragette movement, the First World War, and in 1915, at the age of 23, she married Edwin Teddy Parker, a rising star in Bristol's Labour Party movement. Teddy wasn't just any councillor. He was a union leader, a Labour councillor for the St. Paul's Ward, and a man deeply involved in socialist politics at a time when the Labour movement was reshaping British society. Louisa stood beside him through it all. She was expected to become the city's mayoress, the wife of the mayor, when Teddy's political career reached its peak. They had 2 daughters, Edna and Iris, and Louisa did what many women of her generation did. She ran the household, raised the children, and supported her husband's political ambitions. She was always in the photographs with Teddy, always beside him, always part of the partnership. But in 1945, Teddy died, and Louisa became a widow at 53. She remarried in 1952, this time to a night watchman named John Dunne. But tragedy struck again in 1961 when John died, leaving Louisa widowed for the second time. In 1967, Louisa was 75 years old. She had buried 2 husbands. She had raised 2 daughters. She had lived through 2 world wars, the Spanish flu pandemic, and massive social upheaval. She had been married for a combined total of nearly 4 decades, and she was alone. Her daughters were estranged from her. We don't know the full details of why, but families fracture for all kinds of reasons, and by the time of her death, Louisa wasn't in contact with Edna or Iris. Her granddaughter, Mary Dayton, would later describe her grandmother as a woman she barely knew, someone who existed mostly in old photographs standing beside her grandfather, Teddy. But loneliness doesn't mean invisibility, and Louisa was very visible in her community. She lived in Easton, a close-knit neighborhood in Bristol where families, young professionals, and pensioners all mixed together. It was the kind of place where people knew each other, looked out for each other, noticed when something was off. And Louisa was known. She was the woman who sat at her front door watching the world go by, the one who chatted with neighbors as they passed, the friendly face on Britannia Road. She was small, elderly, living alone in a terraced house. And on June 28, 1967, someone saw that vulnerability and decided to exploit it. The night of June 27, 1967 was likely quiet on Britannia Road. Louisa would have gone to bed in her front room. She had turned the living room into a bedroom, probably because it was easier than navigating the stairs at her age. It's a common adaptation for elderly people living alone. And sometime during the night or in the early hours of June 28th, Ryland Headley forced open her sash window and climbed inside. He was 34 years old, a machinist by trade, married, living in Bristol at the time. Though he had moved to Ipswich in the early 1970s, he was an active burglar. Police would later link him to at least 10 break-ins between 1973 and 1978. But his criminal activity almost certainly started earlier. This wasn't opportunistic. This was targeted. Headley chose Louisa Dunne's home for a reason. She was an elderly woman living alone, vulnerable, isolated, the kind of target predators look for. He broke in through the window, leaving his left palm print on the glass, and once inside, he attacked her. Louisa was found lying on a pile of old clothes on her living room floor. She had been strangled with a scarf. The bruising on her neck told that story. She had been raped, and the evidence suggests she fought back as much as a 75-year-old woman could against a man in his physical prime. A neighbor later reported hearing screams the night before Louisa's body was discovered. Think about that. Someone heard her screaming and didn't call the police, didn't check on her. It was 1967. Maybe they assumed it was something else. Maybe they didn't want to get involved. But Louisa died alone, terrified, in agony, and no one came to help. There was no evidence of a violent struggle in the house. That doesn't mean there wasn't resistance. It means Headley overpowered her quickly. She was small, elderly, alone. He was a grown man in his 30s. The outcome was never in doubt. He raped her, strangled her to death, and then he left, taking whatever valuables he could find. And the next morning, when Louisa's newspaper sat uncollected on her garden wall, her neighbors finally realized something was wrong. The initial investigation was extensive. Police knew they were looking for a killer who'd broken in through the window, raped an elderly woman, and murdered her in her own home. They had physical evidence, the palm print on the window, semen on Louisa's clothing, samples of pubic hair. In 1967, that evidence was almost useless. There was no DNA database, no way to match biological material to a suspect unless you already had that suspect in custody. The palm print was their best lead. and they ran it against 19,000 men, fingerprints and palm prints from everyone they could think of who might be connected. Nothing. No matches. The case went cold, not because investigators didn't care, they did, but because the technology didn't exist to solve it. The evidence sat in storage, carefully preserved, waiting for science to catch up. And Ryland Headley? He went on with his life. He moved his family to Ipswich in the early 1970s, got a job, played the role of a respectable citizen, and he kept breaking into homes. But here's where the story gets darker, because Louisa Dunne wasn't Headley's only victim. She wasn't even his last. In October 1977, 10 years after murdering Louisa, Ryland Headley broke into the home of an 84-year-old widow in Ipswich. He climbed through a ground floor window, found her in bed, put his hands over her face and head, and raped her. When she said she would scream, he told her, "If you do that, that will be worse for you." 4 weeks later, he did it again. Another elderly widow, this time 79 years old. Same method. Break in through the window, overpower her, rape her. He had a type. Elderly women, living alone, accessible through ground floor windows. He was a serial predator with a specific pattern of behavior. And in 1978, he was finally caught. His fingerprint linked him to the rape of the 79-year-old widow. When confronted, he admitted to both rapes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Life imprisonment. He should have died in prison. But then something unconscionable happened. Something that perfectly illustrates how the justice system has historically failed victims of sexual violence, especially when those victims are women and the perpetrators are men with sympathetic narratives. In 1980, doctors appealed Headley's life sentence. Their argument? That his crimes arose from sexual frustration due to his ambitious and demanding wife. Let me repeat that. Medical professionals argued that Ryland Headley, a man who broke into the homes of elderly women and raped them, was driven to his crimes because his wife was too ambitious and demanding. The court agreed. His life sentence was reduced to 7 years. He served approximately 2 years. 2 years for raping 2 elderly women in their own homes. He was released from prison in the early 1980s and went home to his family, to his ambitious and demanding wife, who'd apparently driven him to rape strangers. And for the next 40-plus years, Ryland Headley lived as a free man. He was a grandfather, a great-grandfather, a widower after his wife passed away, a neighbor who kept a tidy garden, appreciated his friends, took care of his cat and his fish. By all accounts, he was kind, respectful, unimposing. No one suspected that the 92-year-old man on Clarence Road in Ipswich was a murderer who had evaded justice for nearly 6 decades. In 2023, Avon and Somerset Police's Major Crime Review Team did what cold case units do. They revisited old evidence inventories, looking for cases that might benefit from modern forensic techniques. They pulled the Louisa Dunne file. 56 years after her murder, detectives sent her clothing, including the blue skirt she'd been wearing the night she was attacked, off for DNA testing. In May 2024, the results came back. Semen recovered from the skirt produced a full DNA profile, and when that profile was run through the UK's National DNA Database, it came back with a match: Ryland Headley. His DNA had been added to the database in 2012 after an arrest for an offense that was ultimately prosecuted. But the cheek swab taken during the arrest stayed in the system, and when detectives ran the DNA from Louisa Dunne's clothing, they got a hit that was 1 billion times more likely to be Headley's DNA than anyone else's. 1 billion to 1. The palm print from the window? Also Headley's. He'd never been asked to provide palm prints during his previous arrests, only fingerprints. So the print from 1967 had never been matched to him. But now, with DNA and the palm print both linking him to the crime scene, police had their man. On November 19, 2024, 57 years, 4 months, and 22 days after Louisa Dunne's murder, 92-year-old Ryland Headley was arrested at his home in Ipswich. He was charged with the rape and murder He denied both charges. His trial began on June 16, 2025, at Bristol Crown Court. It lasted 3 weeks. The jury heard testimony about the 1967 murder. They heard the DNA evidence, the 1,000,000-to-1 match. They heard about the palm print. They heard forensic expert Andrew Perry explain how modern DNA analysis could extract profiles from samples that had been stored for nearly 60 years. And they heard the victim impact statements from the 2 women Headley raped in 1977. Hearing those voices, elderly women describing the terror of being attacked in their own homes by a man who threatened to kill them if they screamed, gave the jury a window into what Louisa Dunne must have experienced in her final moments. After 9 hours and 53 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on both counts, rape and murder. On July 1, 2025, Mr. Justice Derek Sweeting sentenced Riley Headley to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. At 92 years old, Headley will never see freedom again. The judge told him directly, "You will never be released. You will die in prison." Justice, 58 years late, was finally served. Let's talk about intent, because that's what this show is about. Understanding the why behind the crime, the psychology of the offender, the patterns that reveal what was really going on. Ryland Headley's intent was crystal clear from the moment he chose his first victim. He targeted elderly women living alone. This wasn't random. It wasn't opportunistic. It was a deliberate selection based on vulnerability. Elderly women are physically weaker, less likely to fight back successfully, more isolated, and historically less believed when they report sexual assault. Headley knew all of this, consciously or unconsciously, and he exploited it. His method was consistent: break in through ground floor windows, overpower the victim quickly, use threats to enforce compliance. If you scream, it will be worse for you. That's a control tactic. It's about establishing dominance and ensuring the victim's silence through fear. The progression from burglary to rape to murder isn't unusual in serial offenders. Many start with property crimes and escalate to violent crimes as they test boundaries and discover what they can get away with. Headley was a burglar before he was a rapist, and he was a rapist before he was a murderer. Or at least, Louisa Dunne is the only murder we know about so far. Because here's the thing. Investigators openly acknowledge that Headley may be responsible for other unsolved cases. Detective Inspector Dave Marchant said it explicitly. "I think there's every possibility that there are other offenses out there, over the 60s, 70s, however long a time period, which Mr. Headley could be culpable for." A man who raped and murdered a 75-year-old woman in 1967, then raped 2 more elderly women in 1977, doesn't suddenly stop offending just because he served 2 years in prison. The pattern was there. The preference was there. The lack of empathy was there. And the justice system gave him 40 more years of freedom to continue that pattern. Let's talk about that 1980 appeal, because it's important. Medical professionals, doctors who were supposed to understand human behavior and psychology, argued that Headley raped elderly women because his wife was ambitious and demanding. They blamed a woman for a man's decision to break into strangers' homes and sexually assault them. This wasn't an anomaly. This was standard practice in 1980. Hell, it was standard practice well into the 21st century. Remember Brock Turner in 2016? A judge gave him 6 months for sexual assault. He served 3. Because his father argued that his son's life shouldn't be ruined over 20 minutes of action. The idea that men's sexual violence is somehow caused by women, by wives who are too demanding, by victims who are too drunk, by clothing that was too revealing, is a narrative that has protected predators for centuries. And in Headley's case, it worked perfectly. He got out of prison, went home, and lived the rest of his life as a free man, while Louisa Dunne stayed dead, and her family lived with the trauma of an unsolved murder. Headley showed no remorse. During his trial, he didn't give evidence. He didn't testify. He didn't offer any explanation or apology. His defense offered no personal mitigation except to point out that he had lived a quiet life since being released in 1980, as if 40 years of not getting caught for another rape was somehow proof of rehabilitation. The judge saw through it. In his sentencing remarks, Mr. Justice Sweeting described Headley's crimes as showing a complete disregard for human life and dignity. He noted that Headley violated the sanctity of safety of Mrs. Dunne's home, where she had every right to feel secure, and that she must have experienced considerable pain and fear before her death. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a tragic accident. It wasn't a moment of poor judgment. It was a calculated, predatory attack by a man who saw an elderly woman living alone and decided she was an easy target. He intended to break into her home. He intended to rape her. And when she resisted, when she screamed, when she fought, he intended to silence her permanently. That's not sexual frustration. That's not a demanding wife. That's a predator doing what predators do. Louisa Dunne's murder didn't just end her life. It shattered her family. Her granddaughter, Mary Dayton, was 21 years old when her grandmother was murdered. She spoke about the impact during the trial, and her words were devastating. Louisa's daughter, Edna, Mary's mother, never recovered from her mother's murder. The crime left her very ill, according to Mary, to the extent that it clouded the rest of her life. Edna has since passed away, having lived decades under the shadow of her mother's unsolved murder. Here's the thing we need to understand about that grief. Louisa and her daughters were estranged at the time of her death. Mary barely knew her grandmother. She existed mostly in old photographs, but estrangement doesn't erase trauma. If anything, it can make it worse. Because when someone you're estranged from is murdered, you don't just grieve the person you lost. You grieve the reconciliation that will never happen. You carry guilt, wondering if things might have been different if you'd been in contact, if you'd checked on them, if you'd resolved whatever drove you apart. You live with the horror of knowing exactly how they died, what they suffered, what their final moments must have been like. And when that murder goes unsolved for 58 years, you live with the knowledge that the person who did this is still out there, that they might walk past you on the street, that they got away with it. That's what Edna lived with. The estrangement, the brutal murder, the rape, the unsolved case, the knowledge that her mother died alone and terrified and no one was being held accountable. That kind of trauma doesn't heal. It compounds. It clouds everything that comes after. Mary herself grew up in the shadow of that unresolved grief. I accepted that some murders just never get solved, and some people have to live with that emptiness and sadness, she said when she learned that Headley had finally been arrested. Think about that. An entire family, daughters, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, lived for 58 years knowing that the person who killed Louisa was out there somewhere, unpunished. Estranged or not, that's intergenerational trauma. That's the kind of wound that doesn't heal because it never closes. And it's not just Louisa's family who suffered. The two women Headley raped in 1977 lived with their trauma for nearly 50 years before seeing him finally held accountable, not for what he did to them, but for what he did to Louisa. Their voices, read aloud during the trial, were described as incredibly powerful and harrowing by Detective Inspector Marchant. The Easton community was shaken by Louisa's murder in 1967. It was a close-knit neighborhood where people looked out for each other, and suddenly one of their own had been raped and murdered in her home. The sense of safety was shattered, and for 58 years, they lived without answers. The arrest in 2024 came as a shock, not just to the family, but to Headley's neighbors in Ipswich. To them, he was a kind 92-year-old man who loved his garden and his cat. One neighbor told reporters he'd have no concerns about his partner going over to chat with Headley. He seemed harmless. But he wasn't harmless. He was just old. That's the thing about serial predators who age out of active offending. They don't become good people. They just become old people who used to be monsters. And if they're never caught, they get to live out their final years in peace, while their victims stay dead and their victims' families stay traumatized. Headley almost got that ending. He almost died a free man, his secrets buried with him. But modern forensic science caught up, and for once, just this once, the victim's family got to see justice, even if it came 6 decades too late. The conviction of Ryland Headley answered one question: who killed Louisa Dunne? But it raised so many others. How many other victims are out there? Detective Inspector Marchant is working with the National Crime Agency to investigate whether Headley was responsible for other unsolved offenses over the decades. The joint Norfolk and Suffolk Major Investigation Team has announced they'll carry out extensive inquiries into Headley's activities since he moved to Ipswich in the early 1970s. The pattern was there: elderly women, home invasions, sexual assault. Between Louisa in 1967 and the two Ipswich victims in 1977, was there anyone else? After his release from prison in the early 1980s, did he really stop offending, or did he just get better at not leaving evidence? Those are questions we may never be able to answer. Headley isn't cooperating. He showed no remorse, offered no confessions, and at 92, facing life imprisonment with a judge's promise that he'll die in prison, he has no incentive to help investigators solve other cold cases. But the statistical reality is this: serial offenders with a specific victim preference don't typically offend just a handful of times over a decade and then stop. They escalate or they continue. Headley had 58 years of freedom between Louisa's murder and his arrest. What did he do with that time? Another unanswered question: how did the system fail so catastrophically in 1980? We can look back with modern eyes and be horrified that doctors blamed Headley's wife for his crimes, that a court reduced his sentence from life to 7 years, that he served only 2 years for raping 2 elderly women. We can recognize that as a product of its time, a time when women's testimony wasn't valued, when rape victims were blamed, when men's behavior was excused. But that doesn't make it acceptable. It doesn't bring back the years those women lost to trauma. It doesn't undo the damage. And it raises the question: how many Ryland Headleys are still out there? How many elderly victims of sexual violence never saw justice because the system didn't take their cases seriously? How many predators walked free because doctors and judges decided that men couldn't be held accountable for their own actions? The Louisa Dunne case is a victory for modern forensic science. It's proof that cold cases can be solved, that evidence carefully preserved for decades can finally yield answers. But it's also a damning indictment of how badly the justice system failed victims of sexual violence in the 20th century, and in some ways, continues to fail them today. Louisa Dunne was born in 1892, when Queen Victoria was still on the throne. She lived through 2 world wars, the Spanish flu pandemic, the rise of the labor movement, and massive social change. She married twice, buried 2 husbands, raised 2 daughters, was part of Bristol's political scene during a transformative era in British history. She should have been remembered for all of that, for the life she lived, the partnership she built with Teddy Parker, the community she was part of. Instead, she's remembered as the victim in Britain's oldest solved case, the elderly woman who was raped and murdered in her own home by a predator who walked free for 58 years. That's not fair, but it's the truth. Ryland Headley stole Louisa's life in 1967. He stole her family's peace for nearly 6 decades. He stole the sense of safety from her community, and he stole those years from his other victims. The women in 1977 who testified against him, who lived with their trauma while he lived freely just miles away. He's dying in prison now, at 92. A life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years is effectively a death sentence. He'll never breathe free air again. He'll never see his garden or his cat or his family. He'll die behind bars, which is exactly what should have happened in 1978 if justice had properly served the first time. But here's what I want you to take away from this case. Louisa Dunne mattered. She wasn't just a case number or a cold case statistic. She was a woman with a full life, a history, a place in her community. She deserved to grow old in peace. She deserved to collect her newspaper every morning and watch the world go by from her doorstep. And she deserved justice. It took 58 years, but she finally got it. If you want to hear more stories about the dark side of history and the supernatural, check out Freaky Folklore and Destination Terror. And for original horror fiction that'll keep you up at night, give Carman's Crypt a listen. All of my shows are available wherever you're listening to this right now. Until next time, remember, intent doesn't lie. people do. I'm Carman Carrion. This has been Deadly Intent.